Every Sunday, I visit my son's grave. But today, after leaving, I walked past a homeless man in a wheelchair with a heavily scarred face. Suddenly, he grabbed the hem of my shirt and said, "Dad, I am alive." I thought it was a joke. But when he said his next sentence, I was shocked to realize that he was my son, who had died 5 years ago. I'm truly grateful to have you here on Dad's Revenge Stories. Tell me, which city or country are you watching from today? Also, please note, this narrative contains fictionalized details created for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or settings is purely coincidental, but the message itself is worth holding on to. They say grief becomes part of you after long enough. 5 years of visiting that grave every single Sunday, and I still hadn't decided whether that was wisdom or surrender. I was leaning toward surrender. The Sterling County Memorial Cemetery sat on a gentle hill above the town of Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of place old money built to remind itself that even the wealthy eventually ran out of time. The iron gates were tall and black and always cold to the touch, no matter the season. I had touched them so many times, I stopped feeling it. That afternoon, the rain came down in thin, quiet sheets. The kind of October rain that doesn't announce itself, just appears and settles in. I stood before the headstone with my hat in one hand and a bundle of white lilies in the other. White was Lucas's color. He'd told me that once when he was maybe 12 years old, standing in our garden, pointing at the flowers his mother had planted before she passed. "Those ones, Dad," he'd said. "Those are the honest ones." I read the inscription the way I always did. Lucas Mercer, beloved son. 1996 to 2019. I had chosen those words myself, standing in a funeral home 3 days after the fire, barely able to hold a pen. I set the lilies against the base of the stone, straightened up slowly. My back had its own opinions about cold and rain these days, and stood there for a moment longer than I needed to. An old habit. A judge's habit. You don't leave until you're certain you haven't missed anything. I turned to go. That was when I saw him. He was at the far end of the gravel path, maybe 40 yards away, pushing a wheelchair with the grim determination of a man who had learned not to ask for help. The chair was wooden, rough-built, the kind of thing assembled from whatever materials were close at hand. One wheel wobbled with every rotation. His clothes were torn at the elbows and knees, layered the way people layer when they have no other storage, and his face, the left side of his face, bore the kind of scarring that made strangers look away. I did not look away. I watched him push toward me through the rain, and I thought, poor soul. There were a handful of homeless men who drifted through this part of Greenwich, and the cemetery staff tolerated them with quiet Christian charity mostly. I reached into my coat pocket for my wallet. Then he raised his head and looked at me. I stopped breathing. Something moved in my chest, not pain, not recognition, something older and stranger than either. I had spent 30 years on the bench studying human faces. I knew what guilt looked like, what fear looked like, what grief looked like. What was on this man's face underneath the scars and the exhaustion and the 5 years of hard living written into every line, I didn't have a word for it yet. He stopped a few feet from me. His hands were shaking on the wheels. "Sir," he said. His voice was rough, worn down to something barely above a whisper. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you." "You're not bothering me," I said carefully. He swallowed. His jaw tightened the way a person's jaw tightens when they are about to say something that has been building inside them for a very long time. "I know this is going to sound like something a crazy man would say," he began. "I've heard crazy men," I said. "Go ahead." He looked at me. His eyes were brown, dark brown, almost black in the gray light, and they were the steadiest thing about him. "Dad," he said. It's me. The word hit me like a physical thing. I took one step back without meaning to, and my heel caught the edge of the gravel path, and I gripped my cane hard enough that my knuckles ached. Son, I said, and the word came out thin and wrong. I don't know who told you my name or what you want, but my son is buried right behind me. So I'd ask you to please. When I was 10 years old, he said, you took me into the backyard on a Saturday morning in September. You were carrying a tin box, the kind that holds shortbread cookies, the green plaid one that Grandma Mercer used to keep on the kitchen shelf. You said you had something important to show me. My grip on the cane tightened further. You took me to the old oak tree, the one by the back wall, the one with the branch that grew sideways. You made me close my eyes. I heard digging. When you told me to look, the box was in the ground, and inside it was Grandpa Sterling's pocket watch. His voice cracked, but he kept going. You said, Lucas, this is our treasure, just ours, nobody else's. And then you winked at me and said that every man needs one secret worth keeping. The lilies fell out of my hand. I was not aware of moving, but I must have moved, because suddenly I was on my knees on the wet gravel in front of this broken, scarred, rain-soaked man in his homemade wheelchair, and my hands were gripping his arms, and I was shaking harder than he was. Lucas. The name came out of me like something torn loose. Lucas. Dad. His voice broke completely. Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry it took me this long. I pulled him toward me, wheelchair and all, and held on the way I had held him when he was 7 and fell out of that same oak tree and scraped both palms bloody. The way I'd held him at his mother's funeral when he was 14 and didn't understand yet that some things don't get better, only different. The rain came down around us in the empty cemetery, and I held my son and I didn't let go. But even then, even in that moment, the part of my mind that 30 years on the bench had built into something almost separate from the rest of me was already moving. Already asking the question I did not want to ask out loud. If Lucas was alive, and Lucas was here, then whose name had I been reading on that headstone for 5 years? And whoever had put that name there, whoever had needed the world to believe my son was dead, they were still out there. Possibly closer than I knew. I did not take my son home. That decision came to me in the car, somewhere on the wet stretch of Route 124, between the cemetery and the edge of town. Lucas sat in the passenger seat with a blanket I kept in the back for cold mornings, and he was staring out the window at the passing streetlights with the hollow look of a man still not entirely sure he was allowed to exist in a warm, dry place. I kept both hands on the wheel, and I thought about Evelyn, my wife of 6 years. Evelyn Hartwell Mercer. The woman who had held my hand at every Sunday visit to that grave, who had pressed her cheek against my shoulder on the drive home, who had said all the right things for 5 years running. Grief takes time, Arthur. Lucas would want you to keep living. You can't carry this forever. I thought about the way she always said Lucas's name carefully, the way you handle something that might break. And I thought about something else, something I had never quite let myself examine before because grief has a way of crowding out suspicion. The morning after the fire, when the police lieutenant came to the house to deliver the news, I had been in the study. I heard the knock, heard the housekeeper who had worked for us in those years before Evelyn quietly replaced the entire household staff with people of her own choosing. Opened the door, heard the low voice of the officer. And then I heard something that I filed away without understanding it at the time. Before the officer had said a single word about Lucas, Evelyn had made a sound. Not a question, not a gasp. A sound like someone releasing a breath they had been holding for a very long time. I turned onto Hillside Road and pulled up to a small white house I had owned for 11 years, a property I used occasionally when I needed quiet for writing or thinking, and which Evelyn had always called that drafty little box. She never came here. She had never asked for a key. "Where are we?" Lucas asked. His voice was still rough but stronger now, as if the warmth of the car had helped something loosen. "Somewhere safe," I said. "Come inside." I got him through the door and into the armchair by the front window, the good one with the wide arms that I had always meant to reupholster and never had. I made coffee, real coffee, not the herbal nonsense Evelyn had been steeping for me every evening for the past 2 years, claiming it was better for my heart. And I sat across from my son, and I looked at him in proper light for the first time. The scars were worse than I had registered in the rain. The left side of his face had been rebuilt by time and scar tissue rather than medicine. The skin pulled tight along the cheekbone, the ear barely more than a ridge. His hands wrapped around the coffee mug were scarred across the knuckles. He was thin in the way that came from years of not enough, not from weeks of illness. "Tell me," I said. He told me. The night it happened, he had received a text message. He showed me from memory exactly what it said, because he had read it so many times before the accident that it had burned itself into him. "Come to the storage house. Need to show you something urgent. Don't tell anyone. Dad." "I never sent that message," I said. My voice came out very flat and very certain, the way it used to sound when I caught a witness in a lie on the stand. Lucas nodded. "I know that now." "My phone," I said. I set down my coffee cup. "Evelyn has known the passcode to my phone since the week we were married. She said it was for emergencies." Lucas looked at me across the small table. He did not say anything, but his jaw tightened. He continued. He had driven out to the old storage building on the back of the property, the one we used for equipment and boxes of files. When he pushed open the door, the lights were out. He called my name twice. Then something struck him from behind, hard and fast, and the floor came up to meet him. When awareness returned, the heat was already enormous. He could not see. He crawled along the floor by instinct, following the thin line of cooler air he could feel near the base of one wall. There was a gap, a rotted board along the foundation, and he forced himself through it, tearing both arms and most of his left side in the process. He rolled down the gravel slope behind the building and into the creek that ran along the back edge of our property. "The current took me," he said. "I don't know for how long. I don't know how far." "The river," I said. "The creek feeds into the Mianos River half a mile down." I woke up on a bank. There was an old man. He had a fishing line in the water, and he was staring at me like I was something the river had decided to return. Lucas paused. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. "He helped me. I'll tell you more about him later. But Dad, before I passed out in that creek, I looked back. I waited. The storage house was fully on fire by then, and there was a figure standing on the hill above it. He looked at me steadily, just standing there, watching. A woman. I couldn't see her face. But I remember thinking, even half-conscious, that she wasn't calling for help. She was just watching it burn. The kitchen clock ticked against the silence. Outside, the October rain continued its quiet, patient work against the window glass. I picked up my coffee cup, set it down again without drinking. "Lucas," I said carefully. "When the police investigated the fire, they found a body inside. They identified it by the signet ring, the one I gave you for your 21st birthday." My son looked at me with eyes that had seen 5 years of things I could not imagine. He said, "I wasn't wearing that ring that night. I'd left it in the box on my nightstand. My hands were dirty from the garden that afternoon, and I forgot to put it back on." Someone had gone into my son's bedroom. Someone who knew exactly where he kept that ring. Someone who had access to every corner of that house. Someone who still did. I called Roy Dalton at 6:45 the next morning. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he had already been awake. Roy was like that. 31 years as a detective with the Connecticut State Police had rewired his sleep cycle into something closer to a security system than a biological function. He did not sleep so much as stand watch in a horizontal position. "Arthur," he said, "you sound like a man who spent the night not sleeping." "I need you," I said. "Not as a friend, as an investigator." A pause. I heard him set something down, a coffee mug probably. Roy ran on black coffee and stubbornness, two things I had always respected. "Tell me," he said. I told him everything. It took 40 minutes. Roy did not interrupt once, which was how I knew he understood the weight of it. When I finished, the line was quiet for a long moment. "Lucas is alive," he said finally. Not a question. A man reorganizing facts. Lucas is alive," I confirmed. "And someone went to considerable trouble to make sure the world believed otherwise." "Where is he now?" "Hillside Road, the small property." "Good." Another pause. "Arthur, I need 48 hours. Don't move him. Don't contact anyone at the main house. And do not under any circumstances let Evelyn know you've been to the cemetery." I had not planned to. But hearing Roy say it out loud made the reality of it settle into my bones in a way that the long night alone had not quite managed. My wife. The woman who brought me herbal tea every evening and adjusted my reading lamp and asked about my knees on cold mornings. A suspect. Roy called back in 36 hours, not 48. He had always been faster than he promised. He came to Hillside Road himself rather than calling, which told me what he had found was not something he wanted on a phone line. He was a big man. Roy gone soft in the shoulders since retirement, but still carrying himself like someone who expected rooms to pay attention when he entered. He shook Lucas's hand at the door with both of his, held it for a moment, and said, "Good to see you, son," in a voice that came from somewhere far below the professional surface. Then he sat down and laid a photograph on the table. "His name is Walter Cobb," Roy said. 72 years old. Lives in a converted fishing shack on the bank of the Mianus River about 3 miles downstream from your property. He has been living there more or less continuously for the past 9 years. I looked at the photograph. A weathered man with a white beard and the permanent squint of someone who spent most of his life outdoors looking at water. "He's the one who found me," Lucas said quietly. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at the photo with an expression I couldn't read. "He pulled me out." "He did," Roy said. "And he's been carrying something about that night ever since." He looked at me. "He agreed to talk to you. Both of you. But Arthur, I need to prepare you. Walter Cobb is an undocumented immigrant. He came from El Salvador in 2009, crossed through Texas, and made his way north. He's lived entirely off the grid since. No documents, no bank account, no record. That's why he never came forward." "He was afraid of deportation," I said. Terrified. A homeless man with no papers reporting something he witnessed in the middle of the night. He knew what would happen to him. So he stayed quiet, and he fished, and he tried not to think about the young man he had pulled out of the river. Roy paused. "He hasn't succeeded at that last part." We drove to the river that afternoon, Lucas in the back seat with his wheelchair folded beside him. The shack was exactly as Roy had described, a narrow structure built against the riverbank, weathered gray, with a dock that extended 6 feet over the water on posts that had seen better decades. Walter Cobb was waiting on the dock. He stood when he saw our car. Up close, he was smaller than his photograph. His hands were enormous, thick-fingered, river-hardened. When he saw Lucas step out of the car and reach for his wheelchair, Walter pressed one of those huge hands flat against his own chest and held it there like he was checking that his heart was still running. Walter pressed one of those huge hands flat against his own chest and held it there, eyes closed, for a long moment. When he opened them, they were wet at the corners. "You made it," he said softly. "You actually made it." "I made it, Walter," Lucas said. "Thanks to you." Walter shook his head hard, wiping his face with his sleeve. Sit down," he said, pulling over an old crate. "I have to tell you what I saw. I have to say it out loud, or I think it will kill me." I stood to the side and listened. Walter had been on the dock that night, as he often was unable to sleep. Around midnight, he had noticed light on the old bridge upstream headlights, a dark truck engine running. He had watched, because he watched everything on this river. Two figures, one on each side of the bridge railing holding something between them. Then they dropped it over the side. "I thought it was garbage," Walter said, his voice cracking. "People dump things in the river at night. I thought it was a bag of garbage." He stopped. And then the thing they dropped made a sound when it hit the water. And I knew. He had run the length of the dock, launched his small boat, and rowed hard upstream against the current. Lucas had been face down in the shallows where a bend in the river had pushed him against the bank. Walter had dragged him out, cut the rope from his wrists, and carried him inside. Lucas went very still. There was a rope on my wrists. "Yes," Walter said. "Thin rope. Already halfway off, maybe, from the water and the fighting. But yes." I reached out and put my hand on my son's shoulder. He was trembling. "Walter," I said carefully. "The two people on the bridge, can you describe them?" Walter nodded. "One was big old, long coat. The other one was young, tall, red hair." Lucas turned to look at me. His face had gone pale and flat and very quiet. "Dad," he said. "Julian Hartwell has red hair. A good judge learns early that the most dangerous thing in any courtroom is not the guilty man on the stand. It is the innocent expression on his face." I drove back to the estate that evening, with that thought sitting squarely in the center of my mind. The gates opened automatically when my car approached, the way they always did, and the gravel drive curved up through the elm trees toward the house, and the lights were on in the front rooms, the way Evelyn always kept them when she expected me home for dinner. Everything was exactly as it always was. That was the part that turned my stomach. She met me in the entryway. "Arthur." She took my coat with both hands, her fingers brushing my shoulders in that particular way she had, attentive and practiced. "You were gone so long. I was starting to worry." "I stopped to see Roy after the cemetery," I said. "Lost track of time." "How is he?" "Old and stubborn. Same as always." She laughed softly and hung my coat on the rack by the door. Evelyn Hartwell Mercer was a handsome woman, 62 years old, silver-haired, with the posture of someone who had decided long ago that the world would treat her well and had arranged herself accordingly. She handed me a glass of water and touched my arm and said dinner would be ready in 20 minutes, and I watched every movement she made with the attention I used to give to witnesses on the stand. Julian was in the sitting room. His long legs stretched out toward the fireplace, a glass of bourbon in one hand, and his phone in the other. He was 32 years old and had the look of a man who had never been told no in any context that mattered. He glanced up when I entered. "Arthur," he said, with the easy warmth he always performed around me. Rough day. Anniversary visits are never easy, I said, settling into my chair across from him. But necessary, of course. He nodded with what looked like sympathy and turned back to his phone. I watched the fire for a while and said nothing and counted everything I was feeling and put it somewhere deep and quiet, the way I had learned to do in 30 years of hearing things on the bench that made me want to stand up and say something intemperate. A judge's greatest discipline is not wisdom. It is patience. After dinner, I excused myself early and went to my study. Roy had emailed me 2 hours before with an attachment, a spreadsheet he had compiled from publicly available records insurance company databases. He still had connections inside and a contact at a private medical records verification service in Hartford. 3 years of Evelyn's medical invoices cross-referenced against the hospitals and clinics listed as providers. I opened the file and began to read. The first invoice was dated February of 2022. $41,000. Provider listed as the Clinique Beaumont in Geneva, Switzerland, cardiac monitoring and treatment, 2 weeks inpatient. I wrote down the amount on the notepad beside my keyboard. The second invoice, March of 2022, $17,000, same provider. The third, June of 2022, $53,000. A different clinic this time, the Institut Cardiovasculaire in Zurich. I had written the check myself for that one. I remembered signing it at this same desk, Evelyn standing in the doorway, thanking me in that soft voice she used when she wanted something to feel intimate rather than transactional. Roy's notation beside each entry was the same 3 words, provider not verified. I kept reading. The invoices went back 31 months. The total when I added the final column was $412,000. $412,000 paid to medical facilities that, according to Roy's contact, had no record of ever treating a patient named Evelyn Hartwell Mercer. One of the Swiss clinics listed did not exist at all. The address corresponded to a luxury hotel in the Champagne region of France. I set down my pen. I thought about Evelyn returning from those trips with her careful, slightly exhausted smile, the smile of a woman who had been through something difficult and was being brave about it. I thought about the silk scarves and the French perfume she always brought back, the presents she said the clinic's staff had given her as get-well gifts. I thought about how I had felt grateful, genuinely, painfully grateful, that she was recovering, that she was still here, that I had not lost her too after losing Lucas. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and took out the bottle of bourbon I kept there for occasions when the herbal tea Evelyn brewed for me was not sufficient. On the wall above my desk, there was a framed photograph from our wedding day, 6 years ago. Evelyn was laughing at something just off camera, her head tilted back, her eyes bright. I had chosen that photograph because of how real the laugh looked, how unguarded. I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked back at the spreadsheet on my screen, at $412,000 paid to hotels and ghost clinics across Europe, and I understood that the laugh in that photograph was the most rehearsed thing in it. I closed the laptop, finished my bourbon, and sat alone in my study until the house went quiet around me. $412,000. And Roy had told me that afternoon before I left for home that this was only what he had found in 36 hours of looking. There was more. There was always more. The question was not how deep it went. The question was whether I was ready to find out. I decided, sitting in that dark and quiet study with my son's photograph on the corner of the desk and my wife's wedding photo on the wall above it, that I was. She brought the tea at 7:15, the same as every morning. I heard her footsteps on the stairs before I heard the knock. A light, even rhythm unhurried the footsteps of a woman who believed the morning belonged to her. The door opened, and Evelyn came in with the small wooden tray. She always used the one with the inlaid pattern around the edges that she had bought at an antique market in Savannah during our second anniversary trip. The mug was already steeping. The smell reached me before she crossed the room, chamomile, and something underneath it, faintly bitter, that I had always attributed to the particular brand of tea she ordered online from a shop in Vermont. "You were up late," she said, setting the tray on the nightstand. Her eyes moved to the lamp on my which I had forgotten to turn off. "Working? Reading," I said. "Old habit." She straightened and smoothed the front of her robe and smiled at me with that particular morning smile she had, soft, domestic, the smile of a woman entirely at peace with her life. "Drink while it's hot," she said. "You know it doesn't work if you let it go cold." She left. I listened to her footsteps go back down the hallway. I looked at the mug. It was a thing I had never examined before the tea itself. Evelyn had introduced it 2 years ago, presenting it as something she had read about in a wellness article, a blend specifically formulated for men over 65, good for circulation and mental clarity and sleep quality. I had accepted it the way I accepted most things she offered, with gratitude and without question. I had been a grieving man for years, and grieving men are not careful men, but I had not slept well in 2 years. I had assumed that was grief, too. I picked up the mug, carried it to the bathroom, and poured it down the drain. Then I rinsed the mug, filled it with hot water from the tap, and carried it back to the nightstand. If she checked, it would be empty and warm. 3 hours later, I was sitting in the office of Dr. Caleb Frost. Caleb had been our family physician for 19 years. He was the kind of doctor who still made house calls when he felt the situation warranted it, who kept paper files alongside the digital ones, because he did not entirely trust computers with things that mattered. He was 55 years old and had the focused, unhurried manner of a man who understood that most problems got worse when you rushed them. He had been at Eleanor's funeral. He had been at Lucas's too. He was one of perhaps 4 people on Earth I trusted without qualification. I had called him from the car on the way over and asked him to run a full blood panel specifically, including a toxicology screen. When he asked why, I told him I had been experiencing unusual cognitive symptoms for approximately 2 years and had reason to believe the cause might be external rather than age-related. I used the careful, neutral language of the courtroom. Caleb heard what was underneath it immediately. "Sit down, Arthur," he said when I arrived, "and tell me the real version," I told him. He listened without interrupting, in the way that good doctors and good judges both learn, because they understand that the details people choose to include without being asked are often the most important ones. He drew blood himself, rather than sending me to the lab down the hall. He labeled the vials personally and said he would process them through an independent toxicology service he used for exactly these kinds of sensitive cases. Not the standard hospital lab, where results and requests were logged in shared systems. "Caleb," I said while he worked, "if someone wanted to keep an older man slightly confused and compliant without harming him, what would they use?" He did not look up from the vial. "There are several options. The most common in cases I've read about, and I have read about them, Arthur, because this is not as rare as people assume, would be a benzodiazepine in a very low, consistent dose. Something like lorazepam or oxazepam. At low levels, the effects are subtle: mild memory impairment, difficulty concentrating, increased fatigue, reduced capacity for complex decision-making." He set the vial down and looked at me directly. "The kind of symptoms a 70-year-old man might very reasonably attribute to aging." My hands were resting on my knees. I noticed they were completely still, which surprised me because I did not feel still inside. "How long would it take to show up in blood work?" I asked. Depends on the compound and the frequency of dosing. If it's been consistent, it will absolutely be present. He paused. Arthur, is there a particular delivery mechanism you're concerned about? Morning tea, I said. Daily, for approximately 2 years. Caleb set down his pen. He looked at me for a long moment with an expression I had not seen on his face before, not in 19 years of knowing him. It was the look of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about a situation. Results will take 48 hours, he said quietly. I'll call you on your cell, not the house line. I nodded and stood to leave. At the door, I stopped. Caleb, I said. If the results show what I think they'll show, I'm going to need documentation. Everything. Dated, signed, formatted for legal proceedings? He nodded slowly. I know how to write a report that will hold up in court, Arthur. I know you do, I said. That's why I came to you. I drove back to Hillside Road through the afternoon traffic, and the whole way there, I thought about 2 years of morning tea. 2 years of slightly foggy mornings and lost words and documents I had signed and barely remembered signing. 2 years of Evelyn standing at my nightstand with her warm smile and her wooden tray saying, "Drink while it's hot, you know it doesn't work if you let it go cold." I thought about what it meant that she was right. It only worked warm. The knock came at 11:47. I know the exact time because I had been watching the clock on my desk with the particular attention of a man who cannot sleep and has stopped pretending otherwise. The house had gone quiet around 9. Evelyn retired early on weeknights, Julian shortly after, and by 10, the only sounds were the settling of old timber and the wind working its way through the elm trees along the drive. The knock was soft. 3 taps, hesitant, the knock of someone who had changed their mind twice before committing to it. I opened the door. Margaret Owens had worked in this house for 22 years. She had been hired by my first wife, Eleanor, who had trusted her judgment in domestic matters the way I trusted Roy's judgment in investigative ones completely, and without needing reasons. Maggie was 65 years old, built solidly with gray hair she kept in a tight bun, and hands that had spent 2 decades in service to this family and showed every year of it. She had stayed on after Eleanor passed, stayed on after Lucas's funeral, stayed on after Evelyn arrived, and began very gradually and very politely to rearrange everything Eleanor had built. She was standing in my doorway in her robe and slippers, and she was shaking. Not the fine tremor of cold or fatigue. The deep, full-body shaking of someone who had been holding something back for a long time and had finally run out of the strength to hold it. "Maggie," I said. "Come in." She shook her head. "I can't stay long. If she hears me up here..." She stopped, swallowed. "Mr. Mercer, I have to show you something. I should have shown you months ago and I didn't, and I have been living with that every single day and I can't do it anymore." She pressed something into my hand. A piece of paper, small, torn, and blackened along one edge, the kind of remnant that survives a fire only by accident curling away from the heat at the last moment and falling somewhere it shouldn't. I looked at it under the desk lamp. It was a fragment of a financial document. The top portion had burned away entirely, but the lower third was legible. A routing number, an account number, and a name, Hartwell Holdings, LLC. "He was burning papers in the sitting room fireplace," Maggie said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, the words coming fast now like water through a cracked dam. "2 nights ago. It was past 2 in the morning. I came down for my heart medication. I keep it in the kitchen, and I forgot to bring it upstairs. The sitting room door wasn't fully closed, and I saw the light from the fire." "Julian," I said. She nodded, pressing her lips together. "He had a whole stack of papers, maybe an inch thick. He was feeding them in a few at a time and watching them burn. When I saw what he was doing, I backed away before he could see me. But that piece, it must have fluttered out through the fireplace screen when he wasn't looking. It was on the hearthrug. I picked it up on my way back through. I looked at the fragment again. Hartwell Holdings, LLC. Julian's company registered in Delaware, which I had known about in a vague way and never thought to examine because Julian had presented it to me 2 years ago as a vehicle for managing personal investments. Nothing to do with the family finances, he had said, entirely separate. Maggie, I said carefully, this isn't the first thing you've noticed, is it? She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were red, and her jaw was set with the expression of a woman making a decision she knew would change things irrevocably. No, she said. It isn't. She told me then. Sitting in the chair across from my desk with her hands folded tightly in her lap, she told me things she had stored up over 5 years of watching and being afraid. Evelyn entering my study late at night, twice on evenings when she believed I was asleep. Evelyn on the phone in the garden early mornings before anyone else was awake, speaking in a low, rapid voice that Maggie had heard through the kitchen window, but could not make out. Julian meeting with a man Maggie had never seen before in the driveway 3 months ago. The man handed Julian a manila envelope and left without coming inside. And one more thing. The night of the fire, Maggie said. Her voice had dropped so low I had to lean forward to hear it. 5 years ago. I've never told anyone this, Mr. Mercer. Not the police, not anyone. She pressed her hands together until the knuckles whitened. Julian left that night. I heard his car. It was just before 11. He came back around 3 in the morning. I was awake. I don't sleep well when the house isn't right. And that night something felt very wrong. I heard his car in the drive and I looked out my window. She stopped. Go on, I said. His jacket, she said. When he got out of the car, he was carrying his jacket rather than wearing it. He looked down at it once while he was walking to the door, and he bundled it up tight and put it straight in the outdoor trash can by the garage. Not the one in the mudroom, the outdoor one. The room was very quiet. I said, and I kept my voice even with considerable effort. I need you to write down everything you just told me. Every detail in your own words, dated and signed. Can you do that? She straightened in the chair. Something in her face settled the particular settling of someone who has made the decision and is done being afraid of it. Yes, she said. I can do that. I should have done it a long time ago. You're doing it now, I said. That's what matters. After she left, I sat alone with the fragment of paper under the lamp and thought about Julian feeding documents into a fireplace at 2 in the morning, and about a jacket bundled up and thrown into an outdoor trash can at 3 in the morning 5 years ago. Roy needed to know about Hartwell Holdings, LLC, tonight. Nora Simmons called at 8:32 in the morning, 2 days after Maggie's midnight visit. I had been expecting her call, not because I had contacted her yet, but because I had sent Roy the information about Hartwell Holdings, LLC the same night Maggie gave me the document fragment, and Roy had a way of pulling threads that made other threads present themselves. He had called Nora himself as a professional courtesy because Nora had been the Whitfield family's estate attorney before she became mine. The Whitfields being old Greenwich money, who had recommended her to me 15 years ago, and Roy trusted her the way you trust someone who has kept difficult secrets cleanly and without complaint. Arthur, she said when I answered, I need you to come to my office. Today, if possible. Don't bring anyone from the house. Her office was in Hartford, 40 minutes up the highway. I told Evelyn I had a follow-up appointment with Caleb regarding my blood pressure, which was the kind of medical errand she never questioned, because it fell neatly inside the category of things she encouraged: keeping Arthur healthy, keeping Arthur functional, keeping Arthur available for signing things. Nora Simmons was 45 years old, sharp-featured with the kind of focused intelligence that expressed itself as a permanent slight frown, as though the world were a document she was proofreading and finding errors in. She had been handling estate matters for 30 years and had the unsentimental directness of someone who had spent 3 decades delivering news that people were not prepared to receive. She did not offer coffee. She placed a document on the desk between us and turned it so I could read it. "This is your current will," she said. "The one on file with the Connecticut Probate Registry as of 14 months ago." I looked at it. My name at the top. My address. The formal language of estate law moving through the first 2 pages, in the way I remembered from the original document Nora and I had drafted together 8 years ago. And then the 3rd page where the distribution of assets was outlined and the name that should not have been there. Julian Hartwell, sole beneficiary of the Mercer estate, including all real property investment holdings and assets held in the name of the Mercer Family Trust. My name was at the bottom of the page, my signature. I looked at it for a long time without speaking. Nora let me look. "I don't remember signing this," I said finally. "I know," she said, "because I didn't witness it, and I should have. This document was executed through a different attorney, a man named Gerald Pratt, whose office is in Stamford. I've looked into Mr. Pratt. He handles a high volume of estate modifications, primarily for elderly clients, and his reviews on the Connecticut Bar Association registry are," she paused, "not encouraging." "A signature mill," I said. That's an uncharitable characterization," she said, "but not an inaccurate one." She folded her hands on the desk. "Arthur, do you remember the afternoon of September the 14th, last year, a Saturday?" I thought about it. September of last year had been a difficult month. I remembered that, in a general way, the way you remember weather without remembering specific days. I had been foggy through most of it. I had thought it was the anniversary of Lucas's death pressing down on me the way it always did in September. "No," I said. "I don't remember that Saturday specifically." Nora nodded, as though she had expected exactly that answer. "According to the notarized record, you attended Mr. Pratt's office at 2 in the afternoon on that date, accompanied by your wife, and executed this document voluntarily. Mr. Pratt's notes indicate that you appeared, and I'm reading directly here, relaxed and communicative. Relaxed and communicative. The clinical language for a man who had drunk his morning tea and arrived at a document signing in a state of pleasant, medicated cooperation. "Nora," I said, "Dr. Caleb Frost is running a full toxicology panel on my blood. Results are due tomorrow. I have reason to believe that my morning tea has been adulterated with a low-dose sedative compound for approximately 2 years. If that's confirmed, what is the legal standing of documents I signed during that period?" Nora was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had the particular steadiness of a person choosing words with surgical precision. "Under Connecticut law, a will can be contested and invalidated if the testator lacked testamentary capacity at the time of execution, meaning they did not fully understand the nature and extent of their assets, the identity of natural heirs, or the consequences of their decisions. If Dr. Frost's results show what you're suggesting, and if we can establish a consistent pattern of impairment on and around September the 14th, we have a very strong case for invalidation." "And the original will," I said, "the one we drafted together." "Still exists," she said. "It was superseded, not destroyed. If this document is successfully challenged, the previous document is restored." She looked at me steadily. "Arthur, I have to ask you directly. Are you telling me that your wife arranged for you to sign this while you were medicated without your knowledge? I looked at her across the desk for a moment. I'm telling you, I said carefully, that I have evidence suggesting that possibility, and that I intend to build a complete case before I make any formal accusation. She nodded once briskly with the satisfaction of someone who respects a properly constructed sentence. Then let's talk about how we do that, she said. I looked at my signature at the bottom of that page. My handwriting, my name representing a decision I had never made. And I felt something that I had not allowed myself to feel since the night at Hillside Road, when Lucas first told me what had happened. Not grief, not confusion, fury, cold, clear, and very controlled. The kind that had always served me best. Roy arrived at Hillside Road at 4 in the afternoon, carrying a manila envelope thick enough that the metal clasp strained against it. He did not say hello. He set the envelope on the kitchen table, pulled out the chair across from me, and sat down with the deliberate movements of a man who had spent the morning deciding how to deliver something he knew would land hard. Lucas was in the sitting room. Roy glanced toward the doorway. He should hear this, Roy said. Both of you need to hear it together. I called Lucas in. He wheeled himself to the table and looked at the envelope with the careful attention he had developed over 5 years of learning that unexpected things were rarely good ones. I understood that look. I had worn it myself since Sunday at the cemetery. Roy opened the envelope and laid the contents out in 3 separate stacks, the way he used to organize evidence files when he was still on the force. Left stack, center stack, right stack. He tapped the left stack first. Hartwell Holdings, LLC, he said. Registered in Delaware 7 years ago. Sole director and officer Julian Hartwell. Registered agent address in Wilmington, which is standard for Delaware shell companies. It tells you nothing about where the actual activity happens. He paused. What tells you something is the transaction history I was able to pull through a forensic accounting contact at a firm in Boston. Over the past 3 years, approximately $800,000 has moved through that company in a pattern consistent with what investigators call layering money. Comes in from one source, gets divided into smaller transfers, moves through 2 or 3 intermediate accounts, and lands somewhere clean. The charity, Lucas said quietly from across the table. The charity, Roy confirmed. The Mercer Family Foundation. Julian has been generating false invoices for services the foundation never received. Consulting fees, event management facilities, rental and routing the payments to Hartwell Holdings. He looked at me. Arthur, your foundation has lost approximately $800,000 over 3 years to invoices that do not correspond to any real transaction. I looked at the stack of documents Roy had laid out. Pages of transaction records, account numbers, dates. $800,000 taken from a fund I had built in Lucas's memory money, meant for people who had nothing. I kept my face very still. The center stack, I said. Roy moved to it. This is where it gets older and uglier. He laid out a series of photographs, surveillance photos, the grainy, slightly overexposed kind that came from long lens cameras at distance. Thomas Greer, 61 years old, your former business partner. He divested his stake in the Mercer Group 6 years ago, the same year you married Evelyn, and relocated to Miami. You believed it was a business disagreement. His timing, it turns out, was not a coincidence. It was not a business disagreement, I said. It was not a question. It was not, Roy said. He slid the first photograph across to me. A restaurant table, outdoor seating, Miami waterfront. 2 people. Thomas Greer, older and heavier than I remembered, but recognizable. And across the table from him, in a pale yellow dress with her silver hair catching the light unmistakably, Evelyn. Lucas made a sound that was not quite a word. This photograph was taken 11 weeks ago, Roy said, during Evelyn's most recent trip to Switzerland for cardiac treatment. He let that settle for a moment. She flew from JFK to Zurich as documented. She connected through Miami on the return leg, spent 4 days there. This was taken on day 2. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Evelyn's posture was relaxed in a way I had rarely seen at home. Her shoulders down, her head tilted slightly forward, the body language of someone entirely comfortable with the person across from them. "How long?" I said. "That's the right stack," Roy said. He laid out the third stack carefully, like a man handling something he respected for its danger. Financial records, email headers, a timeline he had constructed on a single yellow legal pad in his tight, precise handwriting. "Best I can establish," Roy said, "Evelyn and Thomas Greer have been in contact continuously for at least 9 years, which means they were in contact before you and Evelyn met." He looked at me directly. "Arthur, you met Evelyn at the Hartford Arts Foundation Gala 8 years ago. She was introduced to me by a mutual acquaintance," I said slowly. "Hichati, a man named Douglas Webb," Roy said, "who sits on the board of a commercial real estate investment group in which Thomas Greer holds a significant minority stake." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the elm trees along the edge of the property moved in the late afternoon wind, their remaining leaves catching the low October light. "He built a door into my life," I said. "And then he sent her through it." Lucas had been listening without speaking. Now he set both hands flat on the table and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not grief, not pain, but something harder and more resolved. "Dad," he said, "how long has this been going on?" The planning 7 years minimum. Possibly longer." I looked at the photograph of Evelyn in Miami, relaxed and warm in the afternoon sun, while I was in Greenwich, believing she was recovering from a cardiac procedure that did not exist. The execution began when she married me. Every year since has been a step in a direction she decided before we ever spoke. Lucas picked up the photograph. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it down and looked at me steadily. And I recognized in his face the same thing I had felt walking out of Nora's office 2 days before. Not despair. Something colder and more useful than despair. "What do we do?" he asked. I looked at my son across the kitchen table of the small house where I had hidden him from the woman who had helped plan his disappearance. I thought about 30 years of watching people construct elaborate deceits and then unravel them one loose thread at a time. Because the fundamental problem with elaborate deceits is that they require their architects to keep performing indefinitely. And performers, in my experience, always eventually made a mistake. "Come, we give her a reason to perform," I said. "And then we watch very carefully." I returned to the estate on a Wednesday morning and told Evelyn I had not been sleeping well. This was true, which made it easier to say convincingly. A good performance always has something real underneath it. That was something I had observed from the bench for 30 years, watching defendants and witnesses construct their versions of events. The ones who got caught were the ones who built entirely from fiction. The ones who lasted longest always anchored their stories in something genuine. Evelyn was sympathetic in the way she was always sympathetic, attentive, warm, slightly practiced. She adjusted my reading lamp. She asked whether I had spoken to Caleb about the sleep difficulties. I told her I had an appointment next week, and she nodded and said that was sensible and brought me a glass of water I did not drink. Over breakfast, I looked at nothing in particular and said, "I had the strangest dream last night." Julian looked up from his phone. Evelyn set down her coffee cup. Lucas was in the garden. I said in the slightly unfocused way of a man recounting something that had disturbed him. Standing by the oak tree, clear as anything. I called to him, but he wouldn't turn around. I shook my head slowly. I know it was only a dream, but it felt very real. Evelyn reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Grief does that, she said softly. Especially around the anniversary. It's completely natural, Arthur. Of course, I said. And I looked at her hand on mine and smiled the way a tired old man smiles when he is grateful for comfort. That evening after dinner, while Evelyn was in her sitting room and Julian was in the study making the phone calls he made every evening that he did not know I was aware of, I went to the storage room at the end of the east hallway. Lucas's old things were kept there, boxes I had never been able to bring myself to donate or discard. I found what I was looking for in the third box from the left, a pair of Lucas's old work boots. Canvas mud-stained, the kind he had worn when he helped me in the garden the summer before the fire. I took them to Evelyn's dressing room while she was downstairs, placed them just inside the closet door heel, facing out exactly as Lucas used to leave his shoes. Then I went to bed and listened to the house. At 11:40, I heard Evelyn go upstairs. At 11:53, I heard her open the dressing room door. Then nothing for approximately 4 seconds. And then a sharp intake of breath followed by her voice, low and controlled, calling Julian's name. I lay in the dark and counted their footsteps moving back and forth across the hallway floor above me. Roy had installed 2 small cameras in the main hallway and the sitting room 3 days before, during an afternoon when Evelyn and Julian were both out. The cameras were the kind used in high-end home security systems, barely larger than a coat button, set into the crown molding at the ceiling line, essentially invisible unless you were looking for them and knew precisely where to look. Connecticut law permitted audio and video recording in common areas of a private residence by the property owner without the knowledge of other occupants. I had looked that up very carefully. The next morning, Evelyn came to breakfast, looking as though she had not slept. The skin beneath her eyes was tight and her movements were slightly less fluid than usual, the movements of a woman operating on alertness rather than rest. Julian was already at the table when I came down. He and Evelyn exchanged a glance when I entered, quick, involuntary, the kind of glance people exchange when they have been talking about the person who just walked in. I sat down and said good morning, and asked whether the weather was supposed to clear by the weekend. 2 days later, I placed the second item. A framed photograph of Lucas at 17, the one from his first sailing competition, salt spray on the lens. Lucas grinning with his arm around a trophy that was nearly as tall as he was. I set it on the console table in the hallway outside Evelyn's bedroom door, turned slightly inward, the way you might set something down while searching for your keys. I watched through the camera feed on Roy's laptop at Hillside Road that afternoon. Evelyn walked past the photograph at 2:17 in the afternoon. She stopped. She stood completely still for 11 seconds, which I counted. Then she picked the photograph up, turned it over so the image faced the wall, and set it back down. She did not tell Julian about it that evening. She did not tell anyone. She simply took 2 of the small white tablets from the prescription bottle in her nightstand drawer. The tablets I had identified through a photograph Roy had taken of the label Zolpidem 10 milligrams, prescribed by a physician in Stamford, whose name did not appear in any Connecticut Medical Board directory. She was medicating herself to sleep, with the same category of compound she had been putting in my morning tea. I sat in the kitchen at Hillside Road and looked at the camera feed and thought about the particular justice of that. And I allowed myself, for the first time in a very long time, the small and private satisfaction of knowing that the plan was working exactly as intended. Roy looked at me across the table. "She's rattled," he said. "Good," I said. "Rattled people reach for the people they trust. And when she reaches for Greer, we'll be listening." She called Greer on a Thursday evening at 9:14. I know the exact time, because Roy had set up a recording device connected to the landline in the sitting room. The old phone that Evelyn preferred for long conversations, the one with the cord, she wound around her fingers while she talked a habit I had once found charming. Connecticut law permitted recording of telephone conversations by a party to the call or by the property owner in cases where the recording equipment was installed on premises owned by the consenting party. I had confirmed this with Nora before Roy touched a single wire. I was at Hillside Road when Roy called me. "She's on with Greer," he said. "Recording is running. You need to hear this tonight." I drove to Roy's house where he had the audio equipment set up in his home office, a room that smelled of old case files and the particular brand of pipe tobacco he had switched to after his doctor told him to stop smoking cigarettes. He played the recording from the beginning. Evelyn's voice first lower than her usual register, the voice she used when she did not want sound to carry through walls. "Thomas, something is happening in this house, and I need you to tell me it's nothing." A pause. Then Greer's voice, I had not heard it in 7 years. Measured, deliberate, the voice of a man accustomed to being the calmest person in difficult conversations. "Tell me what you're seeing." "His shoes," Evelyn said. "Lucas's old shoes in my dressing room." A photograph moved. Arthur talking about dreams at breakfast. Her voice tightened. "Thomas, he looked at me this morning across the breakfast table, and there was something in his eyes that I have not seen before. Something very still." "Evelyn!" Greer's voice carried the slight sharpness of a man recalibrating. "Arthur is 70 years old and grieving. He has been showing cognitive decline for 2 years. You told me yourself the medications were working." I stopped the medications 3 weeks ago," Evelyn said. A silence on the line that lasted long enough that Roy and I exchanged a glance across the office. "Why?" Greer said. It was not quite a question. "Because I got nervous," Evelyn said. "Because Caleb Frost called the house asking for Arthur, and when I asked Arthur about it afterward, he was vague in a way he has not been vague before. He was vague on purpose, Thomas. I know what accidental vagueness looks like in that man. This was different." Another silence. "You need to accelerate the timeline," Greer said finally. "The birthday event is in 3 weeks. Julian needs to have those transfer documents ready to execute before the party. If Arthur signs before the party, it doesn't matter what he suspects afterward. The asset transfer will be completed and legally recorded. And if he won't sign, he will sign," Greer said. "He signed the will without question. He was medicated when he signed the will. Then medicate him again." I sat in Roy's home office and listened to Thomas Greer instruct my wife to administer a sedative compound to me without my knowledge, so that I would sign documents transferring my family's assets to Julian Hartwell. I listened to it with the same focused stillness I had trained myself to maintain on the bench when testimony revealed something that made me want to stand up and say something that would have ended my career. 30 years of discipline. It served me well in that moment. Evelyn's voice again quieter now. "Thomas, what if he's already figured something out? What if that's what this is?" "Then we move faster," Greer said. "Get Julian to push up the timeline. Have the documents ready for Saturday. Find a way to get Arthur to sign before the party. And if I can't..." Greer was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something flat and final. "Evelyn, we did not spend 7 years on this to stop now because an old man put a pair of shoes in your closet. Handle it." The call ended. Roy stopped the recording. The office was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a car moved slowly down the residential street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window. "They're going to try to get you to sign the asset transfer documents before the birthday party," Roy said. He said it in the careful, neutral tone of a man presenting facts rather than alarming a friend, which I appreciated. I know, I said. What do you want to do? I thought about Evelyn's voice on that recording, the tightness in it, the fear underneath the control. She was not certain of me. She was close to certain, but not there yet. And that gap, that small, uncertain space between her suspicion and her conviction, was exactly what I needed. I want her to think she's won, I said. I want her to believe that she has managed me, that the Saturday signing is going to happen, that everything is proceeding exactly as planned. I looked at Roy. Can you get me a document that looks like the asset transfer paperwork? Something convincing enough that if she sees it on my desk, she'll believe I've already been given it to review. Roy thought for a moment. I know a document specialist in New Haven, he said. She can produce something that would pass a quick visual inspection. I don't need it to pass anything more than that, I said. I just need Evelyn to see it and stop panicking. A panicked person is an unpredictable person. I need her calm and confident right up until the moment she isn't. Roy nodded slowly. He reached over and ejected the recording from the device labeled the disc in his precise handwriting and placed it in a clear evidence sleeve. Arthur, he said, this recording is going to matter a great deal. I know, I said. Make a copy tonight, one for Nora, one for safekeeping. I drove back to the estate through the dark Connecticut streets and thought about Thomas Greer's voice saying, "Handle it," and about everything those two words contained, and about the fact that in 3 weeks on the night of my 70th birthday, every person who needed to be in that room was going to be there. I told Maggie on a Friday morning while Evelyn and Julian were both out of the house. Evelyn had a hair appointment in Greenwich, the kind of standing appointment she never canceled, which made Friday mornings between 10 and noon the most reliably private window in the week. Julian had left earlier something about a meeting in Stamford that he had mentioned at dinner the night before with the offhand casualness of someone who wants a detail to be heard and then forgotten. I found Maggie in the laundry room, folding linens with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent 22 years making this house run quietly and correctly. I closed the door behind me. Maggie tsaktuchirum. I said, I need to ask you to do something that may feel frightening, but I need you to trust that I am going to make sure nothing bad happens to you as a result of it. She set down the pillowcase she was folding and turned to face me. Her expression was the expression of someone who had been waiting for a specific conversation and was relieved it had finally arrived. You want me to make it official? She said. Yes, I said. A sworn affidavit. Everything you told me in my study that night, written out, formally signed in front of a notary, submitted to my attorney. In Connecticut, a sworn affidavit from a credible witness with direct personal knowledge of events is admissible in both civil and criminal proceedings. What you saw the night of the fire, what you observed about Julian's behavior over 5 years, what you witnessed regarding Evelyn's movements in this house, all of it matters, Maggie. All of it is evidence. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the October wind moved through the elms, and the laundry room window rattled slightly in its frame. Will I have to go to court? She asked. Possibly, I said. I won't lie to you about that, but Nora Simmons will prepare you completely, and I will be there. She picked up the pillowcase again, smoothed it once along the fold, and set it in the basket. It was the gesture of a woman finishing one thing before she started another. All right, she said. When we drove to Nora's office in Hartford that afternoon, Maggie sat across from Nora's desk in the good chair, the one Nora reserved for clients rather than adversaries, and she told her story from the beginning. Nora's paralegal transcribed every word. I sat to the side and did not speak unless Maggie looked to me, which she did 3 times, and each time I nodded and she continued. The affidavit covered 4 areas. First, the night of the fire 5 years ago. Julian leaving the estate before 11 in the evening and returning near 3 in the morning, his jacket bundled and placed directly in the outdoor trash receptacle. Second, Evelyn's nocturnal entries into Arthur's private study on 2 separate occasions when Arthur was believed to be asleep. Third, Julian burning documents in the sitting room fireplace at 2 in the morning, and the fragment Maggie had recovered from the hearthrug. Fourth, a detail Maggie had not mentioned to me before a conversation she had overheard 6 months ago, partially through the kitchen door. Julian's voice on the phone saying the words, "The foundation accounts are clean. There is nothing to find. Tell him to stop looking." Nora looked up from her legal pad when Maggie finished that last part. "Maggie," she said carefully, "are you certain of those specific words?" "I wrote them down that same night," Maggie said. She opened her purse and produced a small spiral notebook, the kind sold at drugstore checkout counters, and turned to a page near the middle. There they were in Maggie's careful, rounded handwriting. The date at the top, the time. The words exactly as she had recited them. Nora looked at me. Something moved behind her eyes, the particular expression of an attorney who has just received something she had not expected and is rapidly recalculating its value. "This is significant," she said. "I know," I said. After Maggie had signed the affidavit before the notary, Nora kept on staff, and after Nora had made 3 certified copies and locked the original in her office safe, I walked Maggie to the car. She was steadier than she had been the night she knocked on my study door. The shaking was gone, replaced by something that looked, if I was reading her correctly, like the particular relief of a person who has set down a weight they have carried alone for too long. "Thank you," I said at the car door. She shook her head firmly. "Don't thank me. I should have done it years ago." I told myself I was protecting my position, protecting my income. She looked at me with the directness of someone who had decided to stop being gentle with herself. "The truth is, I was frightened. And I let that boy, I let Lucas, I let what happened to him go unquestioned because I was frightened. That is something I am going to have to live with. Maggie," I said, "you are here now. That is what counts." She got in the car without another word. I closed the door gently and stood in Nora's parking lot for a moment, looking at the gray October sky above the Hartford rooftops. Roy called as I was getting into the driver's seat. "Julian filed preliminary paperwork with Gerald Pratt's office this morning," he said. "Asset transfer documents. They want Arthur to sign by next Saturday." 1 week. They had given themselves 1 week. I started the car. "Then we have everything we need," I said, "except one thing." "The DNA results from this grave," Roy said. "Call the coroner's office," I said. "Tell them we need those results before Friday." The results came on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days before my birthday. Nora had filed the petition for court-ordered DNA testing 2 weeks earlier, citing newly discovered evidence regarding the identity of remains interred under the name Lucas Mercer at Sterling County Memorial Cemetery. The petition was supported by 2 specific elements: a sworn declaration from a living individual claiming to be Lucas Mercer, and a preliminary comparison of pre-fire dental records provided by Dr. Frost against the forensic reconstruction of the remains on file. Together, Nora argued they established sufficient cause to question whether the correct person had been identified. The petition had been granted by a probate judge in Hartford, a woman I had appeared before twice during my years on the bench, which I considered neither an advantage nor a disadvantage, only a fact. The exhumation had been conducted quietly on a Tuesday morning, when the cemetery was closed to visitors, and the samples had gone directly to a forensic laboratory in New Haven under chain of custody protocols that Nora had specified precisely to ensure the results would be unimpeachable in court. I was at Hillside Road when Nora called. Lucas was at the kitchen table across from me, working through a physical therapy exercise his doctor had assigned, squeezing a rubber ball with his left hand, which had lost significant strength over 5 years of disuse. He had been doing it for 20 minutes without complaint, with the focused, repetitive determination of someone who had decided that every small recovery mattered. I put the call on speaker so he could hear. "Arthur," Nora said, "the DNA profile of the remains does not match Lucas Mercer. There is zero biological relationship to either you or Lucas." Lucas set the rubber ball down on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady. "The remains belong to an unidentified male." Nora continued, "estimated age between 30 and 45 at time of death, consistent with the forensic reconstruction. Roy's contact at the State Missing Persons Registry has already begun cross-referencing the DNA profile against open cases." "Daniel Cruz," I said. "Most likely," Nora said. "Roy sent me the file this morning. Daniel Cruz, 38 years old, reported missing by a shelter worker in Stamford in October of 2019. No family on record. No follow-up investigation beyond initial intake." A brief pause. "Arthur, a man with no family and no resources who disappears in the same month as the fire, whose DNA may match the remains in your son's grave. That is not a coincidence any reasonable person could argue away." "No," I said. "It is not." After I ended the call, Lucas and I sat in the kitchen for a while without moving to do anything in particular. Outside, the afternoon light was doing what October light in Connecticut does in the late afternoon, going gold, and then going fast, the way time moves when you are paying attention to it. "Dad," Lucas said finally. His voice was careful, the voice of someone choosing words the way you choose your footing on uncertain ground. "I need to ask you something. Ask. When this is over, when all of it is done and they are where they belong, what happens to us, to you and me?" He looked at me across the table. 5 years is a long time. I'm not the same person who went to that storage house, and you're not the same person who came to the cemetery every Sunday. He turned the rubber ball over in his hands. "I don't know how to be your son again. I don't know if I remember how." I looked at my son, at the scars and the thinness and the careful way he held himself, the residue of years of learning to take up as little space as possible. And I felt something that was not grief and not anger, and not the cold, focused fury that had been driving me for 3 weeks. It was something older and simpler than any of those things. "Lucas," I said, "you don't have to remember how. We start from where we are." He nodded slowly. His jaw tightened the way it did when he was holding something back. "I used to think about you every day," he said. "Even when I didn't know who you were. There was this feeling, this specific feeling of missing something enormous that I couldn't name. And now I know what it was." He looked up. "It was this. Sitting in a kitchen with you. That's all it was." I reached across the table and put my hand over his. He turned his palm up and held on the way he used to hold on when he was small and the world felt too large. We sat like that for a while. The afternoon light went gold, and then it went. Roy called at 6:30 with the confirmation we had been waiting for. The Missing Persons Registry had returned a preliminary DNA match. Daniel Cruz. 38 years old, no fixed address, last seen in the Stamford shelter system in the 3rd week of October 2019, the same week as the fire. Julian had been giving him money for months beforehand, Roy said. Cash withdrawals from Julian's personal account, irregular amounts every 2 to 3 weeks, started in March of that year. 7 months of payments to a vulnerable man with no family and no one looking for him. I did not say out loud what that meant. Roy knew, I knew, Lucas, who was listening from across the table, knew. "Roy," I said, "we have the affidavit, we have the recording, we have the DNA, we have the financial records." I paused. "There is one thing left." "The confession," Roy said. "We need them to say it," I said, "out loud, in front of witnesses, in a room they cannot leave." I looked at Lucas. "My birthday is in 4 days. Evelyn has invited 200 people. I think we should let the party go forward exactly as planned." Roy was quiet for a moment. "You want to end it there?" he said. "I want to end it there," I said. "In my house, in front of everyone they have spent 7 years trying to impress." I looked at the window, at the dark Connecticut evening settling in beyond the glass. "They built their entire lives on performance, Roy. It seems only right that the last performance is the one that finishes them." Evelyn announced the birthday party at dinner on Friday evening, as though it were entirely her own idea, which, in a manner of speaking, it was. She had been planning it for 6 weeks. I had seen the guest lists and the catering invoices on the kitchen counter, had heard the phone calls with the event coordinator, had watched Julian review seating arrangements with the focused attention of a man who understood that the right audience in the right room at the right moment was worth more than any document. 200 guests, Greenwich's finest, business leaders, local officials, old colleagues from my years on the bench, neighbors who had known the Mercer name for 3 generations, the perfect audience for a public transfer of power. "Arthur," Evelyn said, passing me the bread basket with her warm, domestic smile, "I thought we might use the occasion to make a small announcement about the foundation, about Julian stepping into a more formal leadership role." She glanced at Julian. "Nothing dramatic, just an acknowledgement of the natural transition that has already been happening." "That sounds reasonable," I said. Julian looked at me across the table with the careful attention of a man trying to read a book through a closed cover. "You're comfortable with that," he said. "Julian," I said pleasantly, "it's my birthday. I intend to be comfortable with everything." He smiled. I smiled back. We ate the rest of dinner in the practiced harmony of people who have decided for separate reasons to wait. The next morning, I drove to Hillside Road and sat down with Roy, Nora, Dr. Frost, and Lucas around the kitchen table. It was the first time all 5 of us had been in the same room, and there was a particular quality to the silence before anyone spoke. The silence of people who understand that what they are about to discuss will change things permanently and are taking one final moment to be sure. Nora laid out the legal architecture first. She had prepared a comprehensive package for the Connecticut State Police detective assigned to the case, a man named Sergeant Alan Webb, 30 years on the force, whom Roy had worked alongside twice and trusted completely. The package included the sworn affidavit from Maggie, the recording of Evelyn's call with Greer, the forensic accounting report on Hartwell Holdings, the DNA results from the exhumation, Dr. Frost's toxicology report, confirming the presence of oxazepam in Arthur's bloodstream over an extended period, and the chain of documents connecting Julian to Daniel Cruz through 7 months of cash payments. "Sergeant Webb has reviewed the package," Nora said. "He has authorization to make arrests on the night of the party. He will have 2 officers positioned outside the estate from 9 o'clock onward. On your signal, Roy, they come in." Roy nodded. "Signal is the porch light. On, off, on." Dr. Frost cleared his throat. He was the quietest person in the room, as he generally was, but when he spoke, people listened. "Arthur, I want to be clear about one thing. The toxicology report documents oxazepam consistent with regular low-dose administration over approximately 22 months. That report will be submitted as evidence. But I want you to know your cognitive function now, 3 weeks after cessation of exposure, is entirely consistent with full recovery. Whatever they did, it did not cause permanent damage. I looked at him for a moment. Thank you, Caleb, I said. That matters. Lucas had been quiet through most of the meeting, sitting slightly apart from the table with his wheelchair angled toward the window. Now he spoke. I want to be there, he said. In the room. Not watching from somewhere else, not on a screen. In the room. Roy looked at me. I looked at Lucas. Can you stand? I asked. For a few minutes? With the cane? I've been working on it, he said. He reached beside his chair and picked up the wooden cane Dr. Frost had sourced for him 2 weeks earlier. He positioned it carefully, shifted his weight, and stood. It took effort. I could see it in the set of his jaw and the slight tremor in his left leg, but he was upright. Fully upright, standing in the kitchen of the small house where I had hidden him from the people who had tried to erase him. He stood there for 30 seconds. Then he sat back down, breathing carefully. I can do that, he said. I can do that long enough. Walter Cobb arrived at 2 in the afternoon, brought by Roy from the river shack. He sat at the table in his good clothes, a flannel shirt and dark trousers that Roy had quietly arranged, and looked around the room with the eyes of a man still not entirely certain he belonged in it. Order, I said. On the night of the party, I need you to be at the back entrance of the estate. If Julian tries to leave through that door, I need you to be the first face he sees. Walter looked at me steadily. You think he will run? I think he might try, I said. Walter nodded slowly. Something moved in his face, not anger, but the particular resolve of a man who had carried a wrong thing silently for 5 years and was ready to set it down in the right place. I will be there, he said simply. After everyone had gone, Lucas and I sat alone in the kitchen as the afternoon went quiet around us. He was doing the rubber ball exercise again, left hand slow and steady. Dad, he said without looking up from the ball, are you afraid? I thought about it honestly, the way I had always tried to think about hard questions. No, I said. I've been afraid for 5 years, without knowing what I was afraid of. Now I know exactly what I'm walking into. I looked at my son. That's not frightening. That's the opposite of frightening. Lucas looked up. For the first time since the cemetery, he smiled without anything underneath it. No grief, no pain, no careful management of expression. Just the smile itself, clean and uncomplicated, the smile of a 28-year-old man who had found his way back to a kitchen table. Okay, he said. Then let's finish it. The estate had not looked like this since Eleanor was alive. Every window lit from within the warm light, falling out across the lawn in long rectangles that reached almost to the elm trees along the drive. The catering company had strung white lanterns from the porch to the garden wall, and in the still November air they hung without moving, like a sentence waiting to be finished. 2 valets worked the circular drive with the practiced efficiency of young men who understood that the cars arriving tonight were worth more than their annual salaries combined. I stood at the top of the front steps and watched the guests arrive. Evelyn was beside me in a black dress that had cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. Her silver hair pinned up with the pearl clips she saved for occasions she considered important. She greeted each arrival with the particular warmth of a hostess who has rehearsed sincerity until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. She touched arms. She remembered names. She laughed at the right moments with her head tilted at the right angle. I watched her work and thought, 7 years. 7 years of this performance directed entirely at me. Julian circulated through the arriving guests with a glass of sparkling water in one hand, and his phone discreetly in the other, the way young men do when they are monitoring something they cannot quite control. He wore a navy suit that fit him well, and smiled the smile of a man anticipating a very good evening. He caught my eye twice across the room. Both times I nodded pleasantly and looked away. By 8:30, 200 people filled the main rooms of the Mercer estate. The jazz quartet Evelyn had hired played in the corner of the great room, a pianist, a bassist, a drummer, and a woman who sang standards in a voice that belonged in a better story than this one. Waitstaff moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and small plates of things that tasted expensive. The noise level had reached the particular pitch of a successful party, loud enough that conversations felt private, quiet enough that you could still hear the person beside you. I moved through the room, slowly accepting handshakes and birthday wishes from people I had known for decades, former colleagues from the bench, neighbors whose children had gone to school with Lucas, old friends who had sat beside me at that cemetery every few Sundays and pressed my arm and said the things people say when they do not know what else to offer. Judge Hartley, who had been 2 courtrooms down from mine for 22 years, pumped my hand and said I looked well. I feel well, I said, which was entirely true. At 9 o'clock, Roy arrived. He came through the front door in a dark suit that he had clearly purchased for the occasion because it still had the faint crease lines of a garment recently removed from a box. He accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, took one sip, and began moving toward the west wall of the great room, which was where I had asked him to position himself. Our eyes met briefly as he passed. He gave me the smallest possible nod. The porch light was still on. That meant Sergeant Webb and his officers were in position outside the gate. At 9:20, Julian stepped to the center of the room and raised his glass. The jazz quartet finished their song and left a cooperative silence in its place. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian said with the easy projection of someone who had been practicing this moment for years. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate a truly remarkable man. Arthur Mercer has spent his life in service to justice to his community and to his family. Tonight, we honor that legacy." Applause filled the room. I sat in the chair at the head of the long table Evelyn had arranged for the occasion. The chair of the guest of honor positioned, so that everyone in the room could see me, and I listened to Julian speak about legacy and leadership and the natural passage of responsibility from one generation to the next. Evelyn stood slightly behind Julian, watching the room with her hostess expression firmly in place. But her eyes moved. I had learned to read her eyes over 6 years, and what I read in them tonight was not triumph. Not yet. There was still a residue of the nervousness I had planted in her over the past 3 weeks, a slight vigilance, a monitoring quality, the eyes of a woman who had told herself everything was fine and was still checking to make sure. She looked at me once directly while Julian spoke. I smiled at her. She smiled back, and something in her shoulders released slightly, a millimeter of tension dropping away. She had read my smile as contentment. As an old man, comfortable in his chair, enjoying his birthday, unaware of anything beyond the pleasant noise of a room full of people who wished him well. That was exactly what I needed her to read. Julian was approaching the conclusion of his remarks. Now the moment where he would introduce the formal announcement about the Foundation leadership transition, the moment that was supposed to be the capstone of 7 years of careful construction. "Before we get to the celebration itself," Julian said, his voice carrying easily over the attentive room, "there is one piece of wonderful news that Arthur has asked me to share with all of you tonight." The lights went out, not gradually, not a flicker. Every light in the estate, the chandeliers, the wall sconces, the white lanterns outside the kitchen, The hallway, all of it went dark at once. Cleanly and completely, the way things go dark when someone who knows exactly what they are doing cuts the right connection. 200 people went still. In the darkness for exactly 4 seconds, the only sound was the settling of the old house and the distant sound of the November wind in the elm trees outside. Then the projector screen at the far end of the great room came to life. Before I reveal the shocking truth, next type yes in the comments, so I know you're still here with me. Also, please note the upcoming part contains some fictionalized elements and may not be entirely accurate. If you prefer not to continue, feel free to turn off the video right now. The screen showed the cemetery first. Sterling County Memorial Cemetery. On a rainy Sunday afternoon, the iron gates, the gravel path, the marble headstones standing in rows under a gray sky. The image was still almost peaceful, the kind of photograph that looked like a painting, until you noticed the rain moving in it. 200 people stood in complete silence and watched it. Then the image changed, a headstone close up, the inscription legible to everyone in the room. Lucas Mercer, beloved son, 1996 to 2019. I heard someone near the back of the room draw a sharp breath. The image changed again. A photograph of Lucas at 22 years old, the one from his last birthday before the fire, standing in this very garden, laughing at something just outside the frame. The Lucas that Greenwich remembered. The Lucas that 200 people in this room had mourned. Then the final image. Lucas as he was now. Seated in his wheelchair, photographed 3 days ago at Hillside Road by Roy with a simple digital camera and no particular artistry. The scars, the thinness, the eyes that were unmistakably, undeniably the same eyes as the young man in the birthday photograph. The room made a sound that was not quite any single thing, not a gasp, not a murmur, but something collective and involuntary. The sound of 200 people revising what they believed to be true simultaneously. My voice came through the speakers. Roy had recorded it that morning in the kitchen at Hillside Road, and I had read the words I had written the night before, sitting alone at the table after Lucas had gone to sleep. 5 years ago, I buried my son. I stood at that grave every Sunday for 5 years, and I believed what I had been told. Tonight, I want to tell you all what I have learned. My son did not die in that fire. He was taken from his home and left for dead by people who wanted his inheritance and believed that a grieving old man would be easier to manage than a living heir. They were almost right. Almost. The room was absolutely silent. My son is alive, and tonight he is here. The spotlight. A single focused beam that Roy had rigged to a portable unit positioned in the hallway came on and found the doorway at the east end of the great room. Lucas came through it slowly. He had the cane in his right hand, and he was moving carefully, the deliberate movement of a man who had spent 3 weeks rebuilding the capacity for exactly this many steps. He was wearing a dark blue shirt that Maggie had pressed that afternoon, and his hair was clean, and he held his head level in the way of someone who has decided that the scars on his face are his to carry and not to hide. He crossed the threshold into the great room, and the spotlight followed him, and 200 people saw him, and the room broke. Not all at once. It started at the edges, a woman near the window who pressed both hands over her mouth. A man I recognized as one of my old law clerks, who turned away and then turned back. And then it moved inward through the crowd, like something physical. This recognition, this collective understanding of what they were seeing until the entire room was undone by it, and the sound was no longer controllable and no longer any single thing. I stood up from my chair. I had been sitting for the entirety of Julian's remarks, the comfortable old man in his birthday chair, and now I stood, and the room saw me stand, and the room went quiet again in a different way. The quiet of people who understand that something is about to be said, that they will remember for the rest of their lives. I looked at Evelyn. She was standing exactly where she had been when the lights went out, slightly behind and to the left of where Julian had been speaking, and she had not moved. Her champagne glass was still in her hand. The champagne was still in the glass. Every muscle in her body had gone absolutely rigid, the rigidity of a person whose entire system has received information it was not built to process. Julian was 3 feet to her right. His face had done something I had not seen it do in 6 years of watching him. It had gone entirely blank, emptied of the performance the way a stage looks when the actors have left, and someone has forgotten to turn off the lights. Lucas stopped in the center of the room. He was breathing carefully. I could see it, the measured breath of someone managing effort and emotion simultaneously. He looked around the room at the faces of people who had attended his funeral, who had sent flowers to this house, who had shaken my hand at the cemetery gates, and said they were so sorry for my loss. Then he looked at Evelyn. "Hello, Evelyn," he said. His voice carried easily in the silence. It was steady and clear, and entirely without theatrical intention, just a man saying hello to a woman he knew in a room full of people who needed to hear it. Evelyn's champagne glass slipped from her fingers. It fell in what seemed like slow motion. I watched it turn once in the air, and then it hit the marble floor of the great room and shattered into a sound that was the only sound in the entire estate for 1 full second. Julian took 1 step backward. I looked at my son standing in the center of the room, upright and present and unmistakably alive, and I felt something that I had not felt since the night Eleanor died and left me alone with an infant son and a future I could not yet see the shape of. I felt the specific weight of a thing I had been carrying for so long that I had forgotten it was separate from me, beginning very slowly to lift. I walked to where Lucas was standing. He looked at me when I reached him. His jaw was tight, and his left leg was trembling with the effort of staying upright, and his eyes were bright with something he was not going to let become tears in front of 200 people. I put my hand on his shoulder. "I've got you," I said quietly. "You can let go now." He exhaled. A long, slow breath, the breath of a man releasing something he had been holding since a burning building and a dark river and 5 years of not knowing who he was. I turned to face the room, to face Evelyn. "I think," I said, and my voice was very quiet and very clear, "it is time for some honesty." I did not raise my voice. In 30 years on the bench, I had learned that the quieter a person speaks in a room full of people, the more carefully every person in that room listens. Volume is for people who are uncertain they will be heard. I had no such uncertainty. I had spent 30 years being heard in rooms far more contentious than this one, and I had learned that the most dangerous sentences are the ones delivered at a conversational register, without theater, without warning, the sentences that arrive before anyone has had time to prepare a defense against them. 6 weeks ago, I said, standing beside my son in the center of the great room with 200 guests arranged around us in absolute stillness, I went to the cemetery to visit Lucas's grave. As I have done every Sunday for 5 years, what I found there was not what I expected. No one moved. The broken champagne glass lay on the marble floor exactly where it had fallen, and no one had moved to clean it up, and no one was going to, because something was happening in this room that made the broken glass irrelevant in a way that 200 people understood simultaneously without being told. Evelyn had not moved from the spot where she had been standing when the lights came back on. Julian had taken 2 steps toward the side hallway and stopped when Roy shifted his position very deliberately against the west wall. Roy did not say anything. He simply moved, and Julian understood what the movement meant and stopped. I found my son," I said. "Alive. In a wheelchair he had built himself from scrap wood, wearing clothes that had worn through at every seam. He had spent 5 years without his memory, without his name, without knowing that anyone in the world was looking for him. Because the people who arranged his disappearance needed the world to believe he was dead. And for 5 years the world obliged them." I let that sit for a moment. A room of 200 people has a particular quality of silence when it is genuinely silent, different from the polite quiet of an audience between movements, different from the held breath silence before an announcement. This was the silence of people who have just understood that the ground beneath them is not what they believed it to be, and are waiting very carefully to find out what it actually is. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and removed the small recording device Roy had prepared 3 weeks earlier, a simple digital unit no larger than a deck of playing cards, already cued to the precise position we had agreed on the morning before. I had rehearsed this moment once alone in the kitchen at Hillside Road, and I had decided then that I would not rehearse it again. Some things are better done from the place they come from rather than from memory. 3 weeks ago, I said, my wife made a telephone call. Connecticut law permitted me to record that call through equipment installed in my own home by the property owner without the knowledge of other parties present on the premises. I would like you all to hear a portion of it. I pressed play. Evelyn's voice filled the great room through the portable speaker Roy had positioned behind the projector screen earlier that afternoon, while the catering staff were setting up, and no one was paying attention to an older man in a dark suit, adjusting audio equipment near the baseboards. Her voice, unmistakably, precisely as it had sounded on that Thursday evening when I had sat in Roy's home office and listened to it for the first time, and kept my hands completely still on my knees through an act of will that cost me more than I have admitted to anyone. Then medicate him again. 4 words. In a room of 200 people who had known Evelyn Hartwell Mercer for years, who had attended her fundraising dinners, who had accepted her invitations, who had admired her silver hair and her gracious manner and her evident devotion to her aging husband, 4 words in her own voice spoken to another man about that husband. The sound that moved through the room was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was quiet and structural. The sound of a version of reality that 200 intelligent people had accepted without question, coming apart at every joint simultaneously, not with a crash, but with the specific, almost inaudible sound of something that has been held together by assumption rather than truth finally releasing. Evelyn made a sound, 1 syllable involuntary that was not a word in any language. Julian moved. He turned from the side hallway and went for the back corridor with the sudden committed speed of a man who has just performed the only calculation that matters and arrived at a single conclusion. He pushed through the kitchen door. I heard his footsteps cross the kitchen in 4 strides. I heard the rear entrance door open with both hands behind it. Then I heard nothing for approximately 4 seconds, and then I heard Walter Cobb's voice. "I remember you." Walter was not a large man, and he was 72 years old, and he was wearing the flannel shirt and dark trousers that Roy had quietly arranged for him 2 days before the party. He had stood on that back step in the November cold for the better part of an hour without complaint, because Walter Cobb had spent 5 years standing in the cold and waiting, and 1 more hour was not something he found difficult. He spoke without anger. He spoke without theater. He said exactly 4 words in his quiet, accented voice, and those 4 words stopped Julian Hartwell more completely than any physical barrier could have, because what they contained was not a threat, but a memory, a specific, irrevocable memory from a bridge above a dark river on a night 5 years ago that Julian had believed was witnessed by no one. "From the bridge," Walter said. That night, Sergeant Alan Webb came through the front door of the estate with 2 officers. At the moment, Julian was standing in the open rear doorway with the cold air coming in around him, and his hands at his sides and his eyes on the old fisherman who remembered him from the bridge. Webb was a tall man, with the particular unhurried authority of someone who has been doing his job long enough to understand that urgency is rarely as productive as precision. He moved through the crowd of guests with quiet, practiced courtesy, excusing himself as he passed, nodding to people who stepped aside until he reached the center of the room where I was standing beside my son. "Mr. Mercer," he said. "Sergeant," I said. He looked at Evelyn. She was standing exactly where she had been standing since the lights came on, had not taken a single step in any direction, as though the floor around her had become uncertain, and she did not yet trust it to hold her weight. Her face had done something I had not seen it do in 6 years of watching it. It had stopped performing. The warmth was gone. The practiced sympathy was gone. The careful, constant management of impression that I had mistaken for 6 years for the natural expression of a person who simply happened to be warm and sympathetic, all of it was gone. What was underneath was not what I had expected. It was not defiance. It was not calculation. It was not the cold, strategic blankness of a person preparing a next move. It was exhaustion. The deep structural exhaustion of a person who has been holding something enormous for a very long time, and has just in a room full of 200 witnesses been permanently relieved of the requirement to keep holding it. Nora stepped forward from the far edge of the room and placed a document package on the table beside me with the brisk efficiency of someone who has been waiting for this precise moment for several weeks. "Sergeant Webb has been provided with a comprehensive evidentiary package," she said in the clear, undecorated voice she used when precision mattered more than warmth. "Sworn affidavits, forensic toxicology reports, financial records, recorded communications, DNA analysis from the exhumation, and eyewitness testimony. Everything necessary for charges to be filed and processed tonight." Evelyn looked at me then. Not at the room. Not at Lucas. Not at Nora or Roy or the 2 officers moving toward her position. She looked at me directly, without any of the layers that had been between us for 6 years, without the warmth and the practiced sympathy and the careful management of every impression she had ever allowed me to receive. She looked at me the way people look at each other when everything has been removed, and there is nothing left between them but the simple, unadorned truth of what has passed. "Arthur," she said. Her voice was very quiet, quieter than I had ever heard it. "I never thought you would—" "I know," I said. "That was your mistake." Sergeant Webb nodded to his officers. They moved to where Evelyn was standing, with the formal procedural courtesy that Connecticut law required, and that Webb clearly expected from anyone operating under his authority. She did not resist. She stood very straight, and she looked at nothing in particular, and she allowed it to happen with the stillness of someone who has run out of alternatives and knows it. In the kitchen, the 2nd officer had reached Julian. Walter had stepped to one side to let them through a small, unhurried step, the step of a man who has done what he came to do. Julian had not run, had not moved at all from the doorway since Walter spoke. He was brought back through the kitchen and into the great room with his hands secured behind him, and he walked with his eyes on the floor, and he did not look at his mother, and he did not look at me, and he did not say anything. 200 guests watched in absolute silence. Roy appeared at my right shoulder, close enough that only I could hear him. "Webb's people are already moving on Greer in Miami," he said. "Federal warrant. He won't be hard to find." I nodded. I looked at Lucas, still standing in the center of the room with his cane, watching the officers move Evelyn toward the front door. His face was doing what faces do when something is too large for any single expression to contain. It had gone very still and very internal processing in the private, quiet way that 5 years of surviving alone had taught him. I went to stand beside him. We stood together and watched. The front door of the Mercer estate opened, and the November night came in cold and clear, the way November nights in Connecticut are when the weather has finally decided what it is. And Evelyn Hartwell Mercer walked out of my home for the last time. I did not watch her go all the way to the car. I turned to my son instead. He was looking at me. And in his eyes, in those brown eyes that I had recognized across 40 yards of cemetery gravel on a rainy Sunday afternoon 6 weeks ago, and would have recognized anywhere on earth, there was something I had not seen there since he was a boy. Not relief, not triumph. Rest. The particular hard-won rest of someone who has carried something impossible for a very long time and has finally, irrevocably been allowed to set it down. The trial lasted 11 weeks. I had sat through longer ones during my years on the bench, had watched cases stretch across entire seasons while families waited in hallways and evidence moved through the system with the deliberate, unsentimental pace of institutional justice. But I had never sat on this side of the courtroom before. I had never been the one waiting. I had always been the one deciding. The difference, I discovered, was enormous. Lucas sat beside me every day. He wore a jacket and tie each morning, which I think was his way of honoring the seriousness of the proceedings. This young man, who had spent 5 years owning nothing, now sitting in a Hartford courtroom in pressed clothes, watching the legal system process what had been done to him. He took notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting that was still slightly unsteady, a residue of the nerve damage in his left hand, that Dr. Frost said would continue to improve. He did not miss a single day. Not one. In 11 weeks of proceedings, through early dismissals and late recesses, and days when the testimony was so difficult to sit through, that I had to look at the ceiling and breathe very carefully. Lucas was there in his chair with his legal pad and his jacket, and his steady, scarred face. I have never been more proud of anyone in my life. Nora led the prosecution team's cooperation with the state attorney's office with the focused, methodical precision that I had come to understand was simply how she operated in every circumstance. The evidentiary package she had assembled was by the assessment of every legal observer who commented publicly on the case, one of the most comprehensively documented fraud and conspiracy cases Connecticut had seen in 2 decades. The recording of Evelyn's telephone call with Greer. The toxicology report from Dr. Frost documenting 22 months of oxazepam in my bloodstream. The DNA results from the exhumation identifying the remains as those of Daniel Cruz. The forensic accounting records of Hartwell Holdings. Maggie's sworn affidavit signed and notarized and delivered with the quiet courage of a woman who had waited too long to speak and was finished waiting. Walter Cobb's eyewitness testimony about the bridge delivered in accented English with the simple, unshakable certainty of someone who has replayed a memory 10,000 times and knows every detail of it. Thomas Greer was arrested in Miami 4 days after the party at a waterfront restaurant, where he had been eating dinner with the unhurried confidence of a man who did not yet know his photograph was being circulated to every federal field office in the Southeast. He retained an attorney within the hour and began cooperating with federal investigators within the week. His cooperation was extensive and detailed and motivated entirely by self-interest, which Nora said was the best kind of cooperation, because self-interested people are consistent. They do not revise their stories out of loyalty or sentiment. They tell the truth because the truth is the only currency they have left. Greer's testimony filled in the gaps that the documents had only implied. He described the plan from its origins 7 years ago, the deliberate decision to place Evelyn in my life through Douglas Webb, the patient construction of the relationship across months and then years, the gradual escalation as Greer and Evelyn determined that my estate was large enough and my trust in Evelyn complete enough to justify moving to the next phase. He described Julian's role in the execution of the plan, the specific responsibilities Julian had taken on the payments to Daniel Cruz across 7 months, the coordination of the events of the night of the fire. He described his own role with the prosecutor who had closed the earlier investigation into the family finances, the financial arrangements that had been made the mechanism by which that problem had been quietly resolved. He wept during portions of his testimony. I watched the jury watch him weep. I had watched juries watch witnesses for 30 years, and I knew what I was seeing, the collective silent calculation of 12 people deciding in advance how much weight to assign to a man's tears. When those tears arrived in the specific context of a cooperation agreement that had already reduced his potential sentence by more than half. Not much weight, as it turned out. Evelyn's attorney mounted a defense built primarily on the argument that his client had been a secondary participant, that the planning had been Greer's and Julian's, that Evelyn had followed where others led, that a woman in a difficult marriage to a powerful man could not be held to the same standard of culpability as the architects of the scheme. It was a carefully constructed argument delivered with real skill, and it failed completely because Nora played the recording 3 separate times for the jury and let Evelyn's own voice make the counter-argument in her own words. Then medicate him again. 4 words. Delivered in the calm, certain tone of a woman giving an instruction she expected to be followed without question. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When the foreperson rose to read the verdict on a Thursday morning in December, Lucas reached over without looking at me and took my hand. He held it the same way he had held it across the kitchen table at Hillside Road, the evening we heard the DNA results. The same way I had held his hand in the cemetery in the rain on the afternoon he came back to me. I held on. I listened to the words the justice system had taken 11 weeks to arrive at, and that I had known in my bones were coming since the night I stood in my great room before 200 people and said, "I think it is time for some honesty." Evelyn received 18 years. Julian received 22. Greer, in exchange for his cooperation and the completeness of his testimony, received 11 years in federal custody. Their attorneys were already preparing appeals as the verdicts were read, which Nora told me afterward was entirely standard and expected and would almost certainly fail given the quality and volume of the evidence on record. I did not feel triumph when the verdicts were read. I want to be honest about that, the way I have tried to be honest about everything since the afternoon at the cemetery, when honesty became suddenly and permanently the only option I was willing to consider. What I felt when the foreperson finished speaking was something quieter and more complicated than triumph. A settling the way a structure that has been unsound for a very long time feels when someone finally repairs its foundation. Not joy, not vindication, not the sharp, clean satisfaction I had imagined during the weeks of preparation. Just the particular bone-deep relief of a thing that has been wrong for a long time finally irrevocably becoming right. Outside the courthouse, Lucas stood on the broad stone steps in the December cold, with his cane and his jacket and his steady face, and reporters asked him questions he answered briefly and without drama. He had learned in 5 years of having nothing and being no one how to say exactly what was necessary, and nothing more. It was one of the things those years had given him that I could not have given him any other way. I was not grateful for the years, but I recognized what they had made him. The weeks that followed were quieter than I had expected. The estate was thoroughly examined, the finances untangled, the false documents formally invalidated by the probate court. Nora restored the original will with a satisfaction she did not bother to conceal. The Mercer Family Foundation was audited by an independent firm, and the Hartwell Holdings accounts were identified and frozen pending restitution proceedings that Nora said would take another year, but would ultimately return the full $800,000 to to the Foundation's legitimate purposes. Maggie stayed on. I asked her formally sitting at the kitchen table one morning in January, and she said yes without hesitation and without sentiment, which was entirely consistent with 22 years of knowing her. Roy came to dinner on a Tuesday evening and ate 3 helpings of the pot roast Maggie prepared, and spent the better part of 2 hours telling Lucas stories about the judicial temperament errors I had made on the bench during the 1990s, which Lucas received with an attention and delight that I found in retrospect excessive. Dr. Frost cleared Lucas for increased physical activity in February and referred him to a specialist in Hartford doing significant work in nerve regeneration for patients presenting with Lucas's specific injury profile. Lucas attended every appointment without complaint and did every exercise prescribed and progressed faster than the specialist said he had expected, which did not surprise me at all. I had watched my son spend 11 weeks in a courtroom without missing a day. I understood by then what he was made of. Walter Cobb came to the estate once in the early days of spring for Sunday lunch. He sat at the long dining table that had held 200 people on the evening of the birthday party, and ate quietly, and looked around the room with the careful eyes of a man who understands that he is somewhere he was not certain he would ever be welcome. After lunch, Lucas took him out to see the garden. I stood at the kitchen window and watched them, the old fisherman and my son, moving slowly along the gravel path between the winter bare rose beds, talking in the easy, unhurried way of 2 people who have already said the hardest things to each other and have arrived on the other side of all of it at something that does not require explanation. I thought about justice then, about what it actually looks like when it finally arrives, as opposed to what we imagine it will look like during the long months when we are still waiting for it. It looks like this, I decided. An old fisherman and a young man with a cane walking slowly between bare rose beds in the early spring light. The world continuing around them. The damage real and permanent in some places, and in other places quietly, stubbornly beginning to heal. The oak tree had not changed. That was the thing I noticed first on a Saturday morning in October, when Lucas and I walked out through the back door of the estate into the autumn garden. Everything else had changed: the house, the people in it, the weight of the air inside those rooms, but the oak tree at the back wall stood exactly as it had always stood, its branches reaching in the same crooked directions they had reached for as long as I could remember, its bark carrying the same deep furrows that I had run my fingers along on a September morning 20 years ago, when I buried a tin box at its roots and told my 10-year-old son that every man needed one secret worth keeping. Lucas moved carefully beside me on the gravel path. He was using the cane, but differently than he had used it in the spring, with less weight on it, more as a point of contact than a necessity. Dr. Frost had used the word remarkable at his last appointment, which was not a word Caleb used carelessly. We stopped at the base of the tree. I had brought a hand trowel from the garden shed, the old one with the red handle that had belonged to Eleanor, that I had kept, because I kept things that had belonged to Eleanor. I crouched at the base of the tree, found the slight depression in the soil that years of settling had left above the spot, and began to dig. Lucas watched without speaking. The tin came up after perhaps 2 minutes of careful work. The green plaid shortbread tin, its lid held shut by 20 years of compressed earth and time. I brushed it clean with my hand and straightened and held it out to my son. He took it with both hands. He held it for a moment without opening it, the way you hold something when you need a second to understand that it is real. Then he worked the lid loose and looked inside. The pocket watch lay on a folded square of cloth that had once been white and was now the pale yellow of old things kept in the dark. It was his grandfather's watch, a Waltham made in 1894 with a case of 14-karat gold and a cover that opened on a hinge to reveal the face inside. I had wound it once a year every year since my own father gave it to me. I had wound it even during the 5 years I thought Lucas was gone, because stopping felt like a form of giving up that I was not prepared for. Lucas opened the cover. The second hand was moving. He looked up at me, His eyes were full in the way that eyes get when a person has decided they are going to hold on and is finding it requires more effort than expected. You kept winding it, he said. Every year, I said. First Sunday of September, he looked back at the watch. The second hand moved around the face with the small, precise tick of a mechanism that had been keeping time since before either of us existed. He closed the cover gently and held the watch in his closed hand and stood there under the oak tree in the October morning, while the leaves came down around us in the particular unhurried way that Connecticut leaves fall in autumn, as though they have all the time they need. "Dad," he said finally. His voice was steady. "I want to tell you something. Tell me." When I was living on the street in the years before I remembered who I was, I used to watch fathers with their kids sometimes. In parks outside diners at bus stops. Men my father's age with their grown children. He paused. I didn't know why it made me feel the way it did. I didn't know what I was missing. I just knew I was missing something specific. Something I could almost put my hands on. He opened his hand and looked at the watch in his palm. "It was this," he said. "Standing here, with you." I did not trust my voice for a moment. I looked at the oak tree instead, at the branch that grew sideways, the one Lucas had tried to walk along like a balance beam when he was 9 years old, and fallen from and cried, and refused to admit he was crying. "The center opens," I said when I could. "On the back of the cover. There's an inscription." He turned the watch over and found the small mechanism and opened the back cover. Read what was engraved there. His jaw worked. "To my son," he read aloud, "who will carry this further than I ever could." He closed it again and did not say anything and did not need to. The Mercer Center opened 3 weeks later on a Friday morning in November in a building on the east side of Hartford that had been a warehouse and was now painted the color of new leaves and had 12 residential units and a medical clinic and a job training facility and a room with good light that was specifically designated for people who needed somewhere quiet to sit. Walter Cobb cut the ribbon. He stood at the door of the building with a pair of scissors that were slightly too large for the occasion and looked at the small crowd gathered on the sidewalk. Lucas, Roy, Maggie, Dr. Frost, Nora, a reporter from the Hartford Courant, and 14 men and women who had been through the center's pilot program and now had addresses and income and the specific, quietly fierce dignity of people who have been given a real chance and have not wasted it. Walter cut the ribbon, and the small crowd applauded, and he stepped back and looked at the building for a long moment, the way you look at something you did not expect to be part of. Lucas shook his hand at the door. "Thank you," Lucas said, "for pulling me out of that river." Walter shook his head in the way he always did when anyone thanked him. "You pulled yourself out," he said. "I just made sure you had somewhere to land." That evening, Lucas and I sat on the back porch of the estate as the November dark came in across the garden. The oak tree was bare now, its branches holding nothing but the last of the autumn light. I thought about everything those branches had held over the years. A boy trying to walk a balance beam. A tin box full of one secret worth keeping. 5 years of Sunday mornings when I stood at a grave and talked to someone I thought was gone, and now this. My son beside me in the dark. Both of us quiet, both of us present, both of us exactly where we were supposed to be. "Dad," Lucas said. "Yes. I'm glad I came back." I looked at him, at the scars and the cane and the pocket watch he was turning slowly in his hands, the second hand moving around the face, the way it had moved for 130 years, marking time that belonged to all of us and to none of us. So am I, son, I said. So am I. I have told you my family story. Not because it reflects well on me, it does not entirely. I was a man so deep in grief that I stopped watching the people around me. I trusted where I should have questioned. I signed what I should have read. I let someone into this house and into this life because I was lonely and broken and did not want to be either of those things alone anymore. If there is one thing I want you to take from this family story, it is simply this: do not do what I did. Do not let grief make you careless with your trust. The people who want to take from you will always arrive at your most vulnerable moment. That is not coincidence. That is strategy. I believe God kept Lucas alive in that river for a reason. I do not fully understand that reason, and I have stopped needing to. I only know that my son came back, and that I was given a second chance to be the father he deserved from the beginning. These grandpa stories are not just mine. They belong to every father who has ever loved someone more than he knew how to say. Every family story carries both the darkness and the light, and it is always worth staying for the light. If this grandpa story moved something in you tonight, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are new here, subscribe, because every story on this channel is told with the same honesty you received tonight. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. The story you have just heard contains fictional elements crafted for the purpose of entertainment and reflection. If this type of content is not for you, we respect that completely, and we invite you to explore whatever speaks to your heart instead.